Welcome to this talk on the archaeology of Oakham Castle. I'm Mathew Morris. I work for the University of Leicester Archaeological Services, and for the last couple of years I've led community excavations within the castle, research excavations. But that's not the only part of the story. There's lots of other excavations that have taken part in the castle as well, and hopefully what I can do this evening is draw all of that evidence together and give you some new insights into the castle itself. So Oakham Castle is perhaps one of the Midlands' best kept secrets, really. It's at the heart of Oakham, the county town of Rutland, and within it, whilst there's not a huge amount of ruins or structures surviving, it does still contain one of the finest surviving examples of Norman domestic architecture in Europe, the Great Hall, the late 12th century Great Hall of the castle. This is the only upstanding remains of the castle, however, which sometimes leaves it with an image problem, if you will. People see the Great Hall as the castle rather than it being part of a much wider structure, which sometimes leads them to ask, why is it called a castle? Why is it not called a house? And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll appreciate why it is a castle. The other problem with understanding the castle as well is perhaps the fact that the castle's very well known for its large collection of ceremonial horseshoes that line the walls inside the Great Hall. This is a tradition where peers of the realm and royalty have donated a horseshoe to the castle on their first visit to Oakham, and it dates back to at least the 15th century. No one truly understands why. It's possibly linked to a play on the word ferrers. The ferrers were barons of Oakham, the first barons of Oakham, so it's perhaps a play on the Latin ferrus, ferrers for ironworking and horseshoes and so forth. But no one really knows. But again, in some ways the castle is better known for its horseshoes. In fact, when Time Team did a programme in the castle in 2013, they called it the Horseshoe Hall. That was the title of the programme. So behind all this, though, there is the castle, and there is this story that hopefully the archaeology will start to unravel. But before we start getting into the archaeology, where are we with what's our present state of knowledge in terms of the history of the castle? What documentary sources tell us about it, and how does archaeology then help us further our understanding of it? So if we just quickly have a look through the known history of the castle, we know in the late Saxon period Oakham was part of was a royal manor. It was part of the dower lands of the Queens of Wessex, and the last sort of Saxon owner was Edith of Wessex, the widow of Edward the Confessor. When Edith died, so she kept hold of the manor after the Norman conquest, but when she died in 1075, the manor reverted to the crown, which gives us a potential construction date for the first timber Motte-and-Bailey castle, the castle you see here envisioned in this artwork by Phil Kenning. That's not absolutely certain, though. We don't truly know when the first castle was built. In fact, the first known reference to it by name isn't until 1148. That's when we get our first mention of Oakham Castle. But what we do know, though, is that Oakham was in royal hands until 1130, when Henry I granted the manor to Henry de Ferrers, and it then passed down through the de Ferrers family for a couple of generations, but importantly from our point of view, it was Henry's son Walklin de Ferrers who inherited the castle from his father in 1166, who was responsible for rebuilding it in stone. From about 1180 onwards, he began rebuilding the castle in stone, including the construction of the Great Hall, possibly also the curtain wall and other buildings within the castle as well. And then from then on, we have patchy but fairly detailed records through the 13th and 14th centuries. So in 1264, for instance, we have a reference to the Great Hall being damaged by fire. Possibly during local disturbances during the Second Barons' War, possibly not. It could have been just a accidental fire. The main thing about the castle is there is no known history of it ever being attacked, as far as we know. But this early history, therefore, gives us three of our initial research questions. What was there before the castle? What evidence do we have for the late Anglo-Saxon manor of Oakham? What evidence do we have for the first timber castle? And what evidence do we have for the second stone castle, the rebuilding of it by Walklin? Perhaps our best description of the castle, though, is a description of that stone castle, and it's from an inquisition dated 1340, and that describes, at Oakham there is a certain castle, well walled, and in that castle are a hall, 4 chambers, a chapel, a kitchen, 2 stables, a barn for hay, a house for prisoners, a room for the gatekeeper, and a drawbridge with iron chains. The castle contains within its walls an estimated 2 acres of ground. The same is called the Manor of Oakham. Outside the castle is a garden and fish ponds and a moat, and that is what you see again envisioned here by Phil Kenning. So we have the castle itself, we have the gatehouse, we have the great hall, and then around the outside we have the moat and fish ponds and the gardens. This is a really detailed description of it, but the only structure from that list that still stands that we know positively where it is the Great Hall. But we do have here references to lots of other buildings that could potentially be identified through excavations. By the 14th century, the castle had reverted to royal ownership again. And in the 1360s through to the 1380s, we get a whole series of references in court rolls, so forth, to refurbishments of the castle for a series of royal visits. But by 1388, the buildings are described as being in a poor state and suffering from neglect and lack of maintenance. And it seems generally, by the end of the 14th century, the castle is one of many royal castles, and it is therefore being neglected because it's not often visited. It's not considered one of the most important castles. We then get a huge gap of about 130 odd years through the 15th century into the 16th century, where we have no historical references to the castle at all. We don't have any historic information about what was going on within the castle, if anything was going on. And then by 1521, the old castle is described as all ruinous, with only the hall being maintained because of its role as a courthouse. Oakham Castle is one of the longest running courthouses in the country, or was until it ceased acting as such. And after that, it passes through a number of different owners, and then finally in 1621, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, had the ruins levelled, leaving only the Great Hall standing. So this gives us another set of research questions. What evidence do we have for these later additions and alterations to the castle? What evidence do we also have of that period where the history is missing? How can we further our understanding of that period where we've got a gap in documentary sources? We've also got what evidence do we have for the castle's demise, and also what happened to the castle after it was demolished. The site doesn't stop existing just because it's been cleared of buildings. So what happens onwards into the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries up to the present day? In the 18th to 20th centuries, then, really the focus of alterations in the castle was the Great Hall itself. The rest of the castle was largely open ground and pasture, as you can see in this 1950s photograph with cows grazing within the inner bailey. The alterations to the Great Hall, which is effectively largely untouched from when it was first built, you can still easily today envision it as that medieval hall. The main alterations have included things like the addition of dormer windows, the moving of the main door from one end of the hall to the centre of the aisle, and then the addition of all these extra little structures around to the north and to the west, which are all to do with the site's later use as the assize court and then the magistrates' court. So you've got things like the jury room and later magistrates' court here, and then you've got the a cell block here and the judges' retiring room and robing room here, which were all added in the sort of the 19th and 20th centuries. And then in 1944, the castle was gifted by its last private owner to Rutland County Council, who took it on. And in 2001, the Magistrates' Court ceased using the Great Hall, but Crown Courts and Coroner's Inquests are still occasionally held in the castle to maintain its record as the longest running courthouse in the country. And today it is open to the public as a museum and heritage attraction. So this then is the castle, and what that actually comprises is two areas. It is a scheduled ancient monument. It has been a protected monument since 1915, and that includes two areas. It includes the castle itself, and it includes this area to the north called Cuts Close. The management of the two areas is slightly different. So the castle area is managed by the county council, and Cuts Close, which is a public park, is managed by the town council. Then to the west you've got All Saints Church, and to the south you've got the marketplace and the core of the medieval town, which was always to the south of the castle. So originally in the medieval period the castle was on the northern edge of the town, and everything to the west and north and east of the castle was open fields, with the town just to the south. The Great Hall itself is a Grade 1 listed building, and that was given additional protection in 1950. But if we strip all of the modern stuff away and look at the terrain using LiDAR, we can see that there is substantial earthwork still surviving, even if there aren't any upstanding ruins or structures anymore. So we've got the substantial area of the motte and the bailey of the castle, the main area itself. We've then got this area of low ground, which is part of the castle's moat, but it widens here and is interpreted as a fish pond. And then to the north we've got all these extra earthworks up here that are called Cuts Close, and there's been a lot of speculation about what these earthworks mean over the years. So theories have included the fact that it's the remains of the Saxon burh, the late Saxon burh potentially, or the late Saxon manor, that it's an outer bailey for the castle, that it's the castle's gardens and fish ponds, that it's 17th century Civil War earthworks potentially, or that it's just Victorian landscaping to do with it being emparked as a public park. And there's possibly a bit of all of that going on in some ways. So the areas in red to the north and the west, these earthworks are almost certainly post-medieval in origin and are earth movements to do with the construction of the roads to the north and the west. That doesn't mean necessarily they don't cover earlier earthworks, but they, in their current form, they're almost certainly larger and fairly modern in origin. The fish pond as well, this western extension of it, we know is the site of a 20th century swimming pool or paddling pool, which is quite large, almost the size of the earthwork shown here. And so we're not clear whether this western arm of the fish pond is entirely 20th century or whether the swimming pool occupied something that was there already. It's really only these bits to the east and the south, these bits in green, that probably are of medieval or older origin. But as yet, we've rarely done any work in Cuts Close, and we're no closer to actually understanding it today. My best guess is that it's the gardens and the fish ponds for the castle. It doesn't, for me, work as an outer bailey, in that, as far as we can tell, the entrance to the castle is from the marketplace to the south, and there's no evidence of a link between the castle and Cuts Close to the north, which you would need if it was the outer bailey. It's unlikely to be Civil War earthworks. Oakham itself wasn't particularly affected by the Civil War. The Civil War was to the north of Oakham. The garrison was at Burley on the Hill to the north of Oakham, so not in the castle itself. So there's a question mark still over Cuts Close. It still remains an enigma, and this is perhaps the problem we have with the castle as a whole. This plan of the castle, created by Robert Hartley in the 1980s, to date is the most accurate drawing we have of the castle, and it shows what survives today. It shows the surviving hall, it shows the surviving earthworks, But no one's ever taken it that one step further and looked at those earthworks and looked at the excavations and actually tried to understand how the castle works as a structure, as a wider structure, not just the hall, but how the whole area, whole site within the ramparts worked. And hopefully by the end of this talk, we can move forward with that, and that you'll be able to see how some of these earthworks actually relate to potential buildings within the castle and what those buildings might have been. There have been excavations in the castle, quite a few significant ones. The earliest main excavations were in the 1950s, where we've got just south of the castle on the marketplace, we've got Gathercole's excavations in green, and then inside we've got Barber's excavations in blue. Time Team then filmed a program here and carried out some small excavations in 2012. And then there has been a large program of work between 2016 and 2019 carried out by us, ULAS, the University of Leicester Archaeological Services. There has also been various other little programs of work in cuts close to the north, but I'm not going to focus on those today. They haven't truly revealed anything sort of significant as such, and I want to focus on what's going on inside the castle's ramparts. So to quickly run through then what these excavations have revealed and what this means for us. Peter Gathercole's excavations in 1953-54 focused on the area immediately south of the castle where the post office is today on the marketplace, and it was in advance of the post office being built. And Gathercole excavated a section across the castle's moat, which he found to be at least 12 metres wide and 6 metres deep. And more significantly, he was able to investigate part of the castle's rampart, the earth rampart, and he was able to identify that beneath the earth rampart was a trapped soil layer that contained a late 11th century pottery. And from that he determined that the castle, that sort of square outer bailey, the square bailey of the castle was entirely Norman in date, that it was unlikely to be Saxon in origin that had been adapted into a Norman castle, that it was more likely to be an entirely Norman construction. He also found a little oven dug into the inner bank of the rampart that was of late medieval and early post-medieval date, and that was really the first evidence we have that activity was going on inside the castle in that period where we've got no documentary sources covering it. So it was the first clue that the castle was continuing in some form. John Barber, a few years later, then chose to excavate inside the castle, and he decided to investigate this raised mound to the east of the hall in order to try and work out what the series of blocked doors in the eastern gable end were leading to. It was presumed that they all lead to the service buildings, sort of where you've got these paired doors like this. But you've got 3 doors at ground level, the 2 obvious ones and another blocked up one in the north aisle. And you also have a second door at first floor level in the north aisle, and this blocked window at first floor level as well, suggesting there's quite a complicated history going on at the east end of the hall that we can no longer see. So he excavated 3 trenches across this mound, and beneath the topsoil and a thick layer of building rubble, he found very well preserved floor surfaces. So you can see in these photographs the stone flag floors of this particular building still surviving. And whilst the walls themselves were largely robbed of all their masonry, other structures like this oven here were also found within the buildings. And there was enough evidence for him, and more recently Nick Hill, to interpret these structures as a service wing containing a buttery and a pantry, and then a detached kitchen block to the east of the hall. So re-looking at this, Nick Hills sort of suggests that in its original form, the service block was a single-storey lean-to structure against the east end of the hall, with 2 rooms, the pantry and the buttery, and then a passageway, the middle door being a passageway through the building to the kitchen beyond. And that sometime in the late 13th century, perhaps after the fire that damaged the hall in 1264, that service block was rebuilt as a slightly larger 2-storey structure. still probably having the buttery and the pantry on the ground floor, but then also providing extra accommodation perhaps on the first floor. The kitchen beyond is this square structure with an oven in one corner of the building, and it probably had hearths in the other corners, with the whole space being completely open. And it would have been it's very reminiscent of the kitchen at Leicester Abbey and of the complete and surviving medieval kitchen at Glastonbury Abbey, the 14th century kitchen here. So it's a large square structure. You've got space in the middle of the room basically for your tables and your preparation areas, and then you've got hearths and ovens in the corners of the building. And then you've probably got a sort of pyramid roof with a big louvre at the top to allow smoke out and ventilation and so forth. Time Team then were really the next people to investigate the castle, but the nature of Time Team's programme over 3 days meant that they had a fairly limited window to investigate things. Part of what they wanted to do was reinvestigate John Barber's work because the records were not fully written up at that point, to try and judge how accurate he was and get some more information on his discoveries where things weren't too clear. They also investigated some other trenches, including one in Cuts Close, which was sort of didn't prove anything really. It didn't find any datable material for the outer earthwork in Cuts Close. But 2 trenches, one to the north of the hall and one to the west of the hall, both uncovered well-preserved stone walls beneath rubble layers. And in the one west of the hall was able to identify 2 distinct phases of building on slightly different alignments to each other as well. Unfortunately, again, because of this sort of the short nature of Time Team's work, they weren't able to then take that one step further and actually work out what these buildings were. They were able to prove that there was well-preserved archaeology, but not sort of what that archaeology might mean. But they gave us the starting point for our investigations, our more recent work. That started in 2015 when Rutland County Council was awarded a large heritage lottery fund to restore the castle, and we were awarded the job to carry out the monitoring of all that remedial work that was going on for the restoration. So we carried out on a commercial level, we carried out archaeological monitoring of the construction of the new toilet block, of path widening, of tree and vegetation removal and wall restoration, of the installation of new steps and signs and fences and services and so forth. The largest area we looked at was the footing for the new toilet block immediately north of the hall. It didn't uncover a huge amount of information. It found no evidence of buildings north of the hall. It found large areas of what appeared to be yard surface, which were probably of 13th and 14th century date. Linked with the second phase of the castle, the stone period of the castle. A small area west of the hall as well was looked at, and it did find the continuation of one of Time Team's walls heading towards the hall, but unfortunately a modern gas pipe running through the area rather hampered investigations, and so the majority of the area uncovered only really got down to the top of the 17th and 18th century rubble layer and didn't get to look underneath it. The more significant discoveries of the commercial side of the restoration, though, were linked with the restoration, the vegetation removal and the restoration of the ramparts and the curtain wall. For a long period of time, this is the view of the castle. It was completely encased in mature trees, shrub, brambles, ivy, and to an extent people had actually forgotten the castle still did have a curtain wall. With the removal of all that ivy and the repointing of the wall, though, we've now got this substantial section of curtain wall surviving around the eastern side of the castle. And that's allowed us for the first time to have a true look at how the castle was enclosed by its walls. So there's 2 main sections of surviving masonry. There's this large section to the east side of the castle, and then this slightly shorter section to the west, and we've looked at both of these. The first thing we looked at then was the area around the motte in the southeastern corner of the castle. So this has been covered by trees and ivy for a long period of time. It's hard to call it a motte because it's largely been truncated today. It's missing a large amount. You get the sense it's a motte when you're standing inside the castle, but you wouldn't really know it was there if you're standing outside the castle. But it's this area in the bottom right of the photograph here. What seems to have happened then is that the original earth mound on which would have had a timber watchtower, when the castle was rebuilt in stone in the late 12th or 13th century, that mound and timber tower were seen to have been deemed irrelevant, and so the outer half of the motte was dug away and refaced with a vertical stone wall. And we see that here in this photograph. We can see this is the layered soil of the motte itself. This is the remains of the stone facing, the late 12th or 13th century stone facing, and we can see where it's been chopped. The motte has been chopped away and refaced in stone here with this line. This stonework, though, doesn't appear to be a simple wall. It has odd projections of stonework coming out of it, which has led people to suggest that it might be a tower on the side of the motte. So they've removed the tower off the top of the motte and replaced it with a tower on the side of the motte, projecting out beyond the curtain line of the curtain wall. So you get these odd projections of stonework sticking out from it. And no one's ever been able to prove this before, but it's always been the speculation it was tower, and it turned out the answer was staring us right in the face. It was just covered in ivy. And this area here actually answered the question. When workmen removed the ivy from this area to repoint the stonework, they discovered that behind the ivy, and it's never been seen or documented before as far as I can tell, was the remains of a stone passageway and steps that had been filled with rubble after the passageway had collapsed. And when you looked at the wider picture, so here's the passageway here, what it turned out to be, there was just enough evidence surviving to actually show that this wasn't, the passageway wasn't the recess for a window, but it was a passageway leading to a room which is no longer there. We've just got a bit of the corner of the back wall of the room surviving, and it is a tower. It's the first time we've been able to conclusively prove that there is a tower on the side of the motte, and it's not a simple little watchtower as this drawing shows, which was created before we discovered it. It's fairly substantial. It's got an interior that is probably 5 or 6 meters wide. What we don't know, because the front of the tower is missing, is whether it was a square tower or a drum tower, a curving tower. But it's not a simple watch turret. It is a substantial tower that has got rooms within it, chambers within it. The rest of the eastern curtain wall then stretches away north from the motte. At the southern end, on the other the other end of the motte to the tower, there is this 19th century grotto that has been dug into the remains of the motte. That was when this area outside was part of the gardens of a 19th century house. And then stretching away, we've got this long stretch of curtain wall. But now that we can look at it, we can see various things, elements about its construction. It has put log holes in it for the scaffolding points from when it was built, which you sort of see on lots of castles. But what we also see within this wall are vertical sections within it, and there's several of them. There's one regularly spaced, there's at least 2 or 3 vertical sections which show that the wall hasn't been built as a continuous section, but has been built in separate pieces that have not been properly keyed together, which sort of gives it that lack of strength you would assume to be a truly defensive wall. So perhaps the stone curtain walls were more for show than they were for defence. That doesn't mean they're not substantial, though. When you look at the width of them, they are 2.5 to 3 meters thick by the looks of it. And increasingly, it looks like, when you can see here, you can see sort of the inner slope of the rampart here and the outer slope of the rampart here. What it increasingly is looking like is actually that is less the earth rampart and more fallen rubble from a large freestanding wall. And it might be that large sections of the original earth ramparts for the timber castle were deliberately removed to make way for the wall rather than the wall being built on top or in front of them. On the western side, it's a lot more complicated to understand. It's a shorter section of masonry. There is a clear piece of curtain wall at the southern end, and then we've got these various projections of masonry that might be the remains of another tower on the west side of the motte, although it's harder to prove on this side. And then just to the north of this possible tower is another passageway cutting through the wall. And this, we actually have a photograph of this from 1903 that shows it still with its vaulting on. Sadly, erosion mainly from trees, roots and storm damage means that it now no longer has that vaulting on it. That's collapsed a long time ago. But we can still see the outline of this passageway. It's not been excavated, so it's unclear whether it is an actual postern gate, an actual passageway through the wall, or whether it's the recess for a window, that with the window now, because the facing stones are missing, with the window now missing. More recently, we've been looking at the two areas that Time Team started investigating, and these have been community digs. So part of the Heritage Lottery funding for the restoration involved 2 seasons of community excavation, where a small team of university archaeologists led by myself supervised and trained volunteers from the local community and wider community, and we have had probably over 100 volunteers take part over the 2 years of the excavation, ranging from the age of 15 up to 80. It was open to all, anyone could take part, no experience was needed. We've also had injured service personnel via Operation Nightingale taking part with it as well, school children, the Young Archaeologists Club and so forth. The whole point was to engage people with the history of the castle and learn more about Oakham itself. So this focused on 2 areas. Area 1 would look at Time Team's wall that had been found north of the hall, and Area 2 would look at the 2 phases of walling that Time Team found west of the hall. And remember our research questions. We weren't just interested in the castle, but we were interested in what happened after the castle as well, after that demolition. So the removal of the topsoil, for instance, from the excavation areas has thrown up a huge array of finds that are of post-medieval date. We have clay tobacco pipes. One of my favourite is this Cross and Blackwell anchovy paste jar lid from 1839. We have copper alloy buttons, so sort of like buttons from dress coats. We've got lead pistol shot and gun flints. We've got bone knife handles. We've got all sorts of refuse strewn across through the topsoil, pottery, bone, etc. The romantics amongst the excavation team like to imagine that the pistol shot was the fact that duels were being fought on the site. Maybe not. It may be people just firing into the bank for target practice. There was a mixture of fired shot and unfired shot, so pistol shot that had been dropped before being fired, and the gunflint had definitely been damaged through firing and had been discarded. Some of the other finds, though, might be, or are more likely to be, refuse dumped in the grounds of the castle after it was derelict, possibly evidence of the marketplace and the functions of the town, and it's sort of wheeling carts of refuse up and dumping them on the ground. Or possibly some of it is linked with the use of the site as a courthouse in that post-medieval period. Beneath the topsoil then was a thick layer, and this covers the entire castle, a thick layer of building rubble that seems to be of early 17th century date and seems to be consistent with this known date when the Duke of Buckingham cleared the site and pushed over all the remaining ruins and flattened and levelled off the site and sort of generally tidied it up. And within that rubble we find other slightly older finds. So we have things, we have a mixture of more modern things, sort of like this ceramic bird head decoration off some sort of a ceramic vessel. We've got these little decorative strap fittings, for instance. We had the articulated remains of a small carnivore, possibly a dog, sort of trapped under the rubble, and I hope he hadn't been squashed by it, but who knows. And as he started tidying the rubble up, you could start to see wall lines appearing from the rubble as well. So it seemed to be that the buildings had been demolished, and everything that was unusable, all the building material that was unusable, had been left spread across the site and sort of carefully levelled off and flattened off. But from the evidence of Time Team's wall, those mounds of rubble, and any sort of mound you see within the castle area, is almost certainly going to have a building underneath it, protected by this layer of rubble. And within that rubble, then we have some of these slightly older finds. So we've got this lovely little hooked clasp, which is some sort of, it's double hooked. There's a little hook at each end, and then it's got this little decorative wire wrapped cross. This is sort of 15th or 16th century date, and it's a little clothes fastener, something that would have held fastened together a decorative element of clothing. It's very delicate and small. We've also had evidence of it, what you'd hope to find in a castle. Things like we've had an arrowhead come out as well, a long barbed variant, probably 14th or 15th century in date. But this is where the difference between the small excavations of Time Team and what hampered Time Team and our excavations being able to do. So this is Time Team's trench, and this is the wall that they found here, running across the middle from north to south. And from this small excavation, they struggled to determine whether this was a freestanding boundary wall or whether this was a building wall. And if it was a building wall, what was inside and what was outside. We've had the luxury of being able to open much larger excavations over 2 years. And this is what we have uncovered. So over the 2 seasons of excavation, we have uncovered the remains of a substantial stone building, of which Time Team's wall was the western side of it. But before I explain the building, there is our first evidence, perhaps, of the timber castle underneath the building. Unfortunately, it's very slight evidence. At the bottom, beneath the floor of the stone building, we found a line of post holes which seemed to be at right angles to a potential stone wall, or the remains of a stone wall. There was also an early pit underneath it. Unfortunately, none of them contained any pottery. So whilst we can say they definitely predate the stone building, we don't have a date. We don't know whether it's evidence of the Saxon pre-castle period or whether it's the first evidence for the timber castle. But it's certainly our first evidence within the entire site of an earlier phase of activity than the stone phase of the castle. What's also interesting is that the stone building seems to mimic its alignment, as if the stone building is perhaps a direct replacement for an earlier timber structure. The stone building is substantial. It is about 6 meters wide. The interior is about 6 meters wide, and it is over 20 meters in length. Unfortunately, through a slight misjudgment of machining, we managed to just miss the northern end of the building. I think we'd missed it by about 1 or 2 meters. So the original phase of the building is about 20 meters long. It's fairly simple interior. It seems to be divided, from what we can see, into 2 rooms in its original phase. We've got a large, fairly blank southern room, and then this larger, busier northern room. The only external door we've found is on the east side of the building, and it's quite narrow. It's not a barn door. It seems to be a single leaf door in its width, and there is a door space connecting the 2 internal rooms as well. As far as we can tell, the southern room does not have any external doors, but there is quite a lot of missing wall in the northern section of the building, so it might be that there were other larger doors in the northern section that we can no longer see. In terms of what was going on inside it, we have some slight evidence, but because this is a protected monument, we can't unduly damage the surviving structure. We've carefully removed areas of soil and collapsed rubble to uncover what's beneath, and done some selective slots to see what's even deeper, but we haven't whole-scale removed later activity to see what the earlier activity is. We also have direct evidence of Buckingham's demolition, so we can see that the building has stone walls, and the internal wall here, this mass of rubble here in the centre, is the collapsed internal wall where it's been pushed over, and it's still there as all its tipped over masonry spread out, which also tells us that the walls were of some height. These aren't low dwarf walls for a timber building. It looks like this building was entirely of stone, with the stone rising to the sort of the full height of the building. The stone is using the local ironstone and mudstone with a little bit of reused limestone and so forth in it. There is some evidence of rebuilding, and in general, whilst it's stone, it's very crude. The core of the wall is mud bonded, and there's no evidence really that mortar was used, although weathering might have removed any outer surfaces of mortar and plaster. There is a slight plinth for the building, but it has no foundations. It is sitting on ground surface. And the soil around the outside of it, the accumulated soil around the outside of it, was full of pottery ranging from the mid 11th century all the way through to the sort of the early 15th century. We also have evidence of how crude it was. For instance, the gable wall and the side walls were not keyed together. This might be because there was maybe a bigger opening on the gable end. Perhaps it was originally like a cart shed with an open gable end that's been blocked up at a later date. But certainly the fact that it hadn't been keyed into the side wall meant that when it was demolished, the wall you could see was tipping over. You've got a curve of the wall here where the masonry is tipped over. And this massive mound of rubble was piled up around the outside of it, which has sort of protected it. So the walls in this corner of the building still survive to about 1 metre in height in places. In other areas of the building, though, the walls were completely missing, or were only 1 or 2 courses high. So it had varying degrees of demolition across the structure. This is the east side of the structure, for instance, and we can see here that the walls aren't very high, the surviving walls. This is the internal wall, and it's where it's collapsed over. This is the doorway in the middle of the photograph here. This is the doorway, and this is one of our earliest structures. Running through the doorway is a stone-capped drain coming out from the interior of the building into this area to the east. And adjacent to it, up against the wall of the east wall of the building, was the remains of an early hearth. Here we go. This is on the right is the stone-capped drain, and on the left is the remains of the hearth, still with its final firing, the ash from its final firing inside it. And we did initially think perhaps it was an earlier hearth, that the wall was going over the top of it, but it seems to be that it is deliberately built up against the wall, and you can see the scorched stone at the back where the fire has discoloured the ironstone at the back of the fire. It has a stone flag surface in it, and excavating the ash has produced some molten lead fragments from it. So it might be that there was, at least at one point in its final firing, there was some sort of metal working going on in this building. We haven't fully processed all the evidence from this year's excavation, or last year's excavation yet. That's the second year. So we still hope to find some interesting evidence, environmental evidence from the drain fill and from the ash of the fire itself that might give us some more clues to what it was being used for. The building had gone through quite a long period. It had a long life, and it had gone through quite a long period of history, of use. So initially we had that period where we've got these 2 rooms. The northern room has got this hearth in it, this drain coming out of it. The building then at some point seems to have fallen into disuse, and a thick layer of soil accumulated across the floor in that earlier phase of activity, those earlier hearths, almost as if the building was derelict and perhaps roofless. That new level that acted as a new earth floor level for a second phase of activity when the building seems to have been put back into use again. And we have trampled burning on that higher floor surface, and scorching of the walls as well at that higher level, where the scorching doesn't go any deeper than that soil build-up, suggesting that perhaps at some point the building might have burnt down, or there'd been a serious fire in the building at any rate. Then again, there's further soil and rubble building up, further soil accumulation, and then we've got showing that for a long period of time then the building was derelict before its final demolition in the early 17th century dropped all of this rubble from the remaining walls that were still poking above the ground down over it. But because there'd been quite a lot of soil accumulation inside the building and outside it before that final demolition, that's what meant the walls still survived to about 1 metre of height. They'd already been buried by about 1 metre of soil before that final demolition, which gives us our preservation. What seems to be dating this then is that soil outside the building, as far as we can tell, has a TPQ, a terminus postquem, of the 13th or 14th century, suggesting that the building was in place before this soil accumulated. So the building was probably of 13th or 14th century date. Exactly what the different phases of activity inside it and how far apart they are, we don't quite know yet. We haven't had the full analysis of the pottery. But it might be these two phases of activity were separated by at least a century, if not longer. And this final phase of activity may have been 15th or 16th century. And then we've got the 17th century demolition of the building, the final demolition of the building. That second reuse of the building, the repurposing of the building, radically remodeled it. It shortened it. So it demolished the northern sort of 5 meters or so of it and shortened the building to about 18 meters. And in doing so, incorporated a series of structures into its new northern gable end. So it kept the internal partition, it kept the southern room and the northern room with this 2-partition interior, and it kept the doorway, but it rebuilt the northern gable end, and in doing so it incorporated these large stone hearths into the corners of the building. And then there's this additional structure built outside it, and these all seem to have some sort of industrial function. These hearths then, they're wonderful, they're fantastic keyhole shaped features, semi-sunken, so you've got a slightly sunken flue leading into the hearth itself, which is partially raised above the ground. And then originally there was a wall at the back of them, and then outside the building there's this additional stone structure that's collapsed in on itself, which is quite hard to, again, we didn't investigate this area fully because we didn't want to damage the surviving masonry. It's difficult to interpret what this is, but it must be linked to what's going on with the hearths, I think. I think they're all interconnected in some fashion. These hearths then are semi-raised, and they've had fire inside them, but haven't had a huge amount of intense heat going on inside them. So what we hope is that the fire residues from them might give us some indications, but my best guess is that they're not bread ovens or pottery kilns, but rather hearths to support raised wooden raised metal vats, so something like brewing going on inside them. And my best guess is that it's been repurposed as a brew house. Another thing you might have these raised vats for would be dyeing, and hopefully the environmental evidence will distinguish between it. But my guess is it's going to be a brew house. West of the hall, we were able to look at the area, we were able to dig into the bank itself, and we were able to look at the a series of structures that had been built in the very tight gap between the hall and the curtain wall of the castle. These were all covered by a thick mound of rubble that was presumably rubble that had fallen from the curtain wall itself and had buried the remains of the buildings. And we can see that with this wall appearing out of the section of the trench. We can see the corner of a building here still surviving to about 1/2 metre in height, the wall itself, completely buried beneath thick layers of soil and rubble and then topsoil. And that rubble again was producing finds of 16th and 17th century date, such as this lovely Nuremberg jeton struck by Hans Schultz, one of the Hans Schultz in the late 16th or early 17th century, so nicely dating the demolition of the rubble. So again, we can have a look here. We've got Time Team's little trench here, which found these two phases of building that were on different orientations to each other. And then we've got a lot more structures going on around it. So we were able to identify that the earliest building west of the hall, in this area west of the hall, was this large stone structure. We've only got one corner of it, the southeastern corner of it, marked by this little slight stone pilaster corner buttress. And we think this is possibly the original solar block for the stone castle, contemporary with the Great Hall itself. So architecturally, these little shallow pilaster buttresses, corner buttresses, are very characteristic of late 12th century architecture, as we can see with this example here at St Nicholas's Church at Castle Hedingham in Essex. This is much higher quality masonry than the building north of the hall. We can see that it has ashlar dressing within it incorporated, and the walls are most definitely mortared here rather than mud bonded. Running up to that building then were two parallel walls that appear to be the remains of a covered walkway. Again, they've got shallow stone foundations, and in between them they have a mortar surface as well, suggesting that it might have had a tiled floor originally. There's no evidence of how of a doorway into the hall at this point, and we wouldn't expect necessarily there to be a doorway into the solar block at ground floor level. Inside the solar block there is an earth floor, so it's more likely to be that this covered walkway has got a staircase in it running up to the first floor, with the residential apartments being at first floor level. At some point in the castle's history then, that covered walkway was swept away and replaced by new buildings to the east and to the south of the solar block. And they seem to have been connected to each other by a new covered walkway, perhaps, some sort of porch structure supported by these large pad stones, or perhaps these pad stones represent a new staircase running up to them at first floor level, or even perhaps some sort of balcony, supporting some sort of balcony connecting all the buildings together at first floor level. And we then get extra buildings being added to the south as well, but these are unfazed at the minute. We're unclear whether these are contemporary with the construction of the solar block or contemporary with the construction of the later buildings. We've therefore then explained what Time Team's two walls were then. The earliest wall, Wall 2, was the remains of this covered walkway, and Wall 1, the later of the two walls, was the remains of one of these later buildings built up against the solar block. And we've also managed to explain why the wall abruptly stopped at its west end. Time Team thought it had perhaps been robbed away at its west end, but because we've been able to look around it, we've now been able to determine that it has a doorway at its west end. It was deliberately designed to stop, and there's this surviving block with a door rebate cut into it. We also can now see that to the north of Time Team's wall there is a substantial stone floor surface as well. The finds then from this end of the castle are much higher quality than the finds to the north, and they also suggest a change in activity. So all the finds to the north in the building to the north have been very functional, practical finds, suggesting the service end of the castle, preparation of food, cooking, industrial activity, industrial working, metal working and so forth. To the west of the hall, the finds all seem to be linked with fine living. So we've got things like, we've got fragments of elaborate jugs, tableware jugs, we've got knives, the sort of things you might eat food with, we've got other little dropped things, we've got whetstones for sharpening knives, this little lead fishing weight came up as well. And we've also got these lovely delicate dress pins or hair pins. They're incredibly fine, and they would probably be used to fix clothing, like we can see in this portrait of a lady, this 15th century portrait of a lady, where we can see the detail of her wimple. We can see pins just like these being used to fix the layers of cloth together and to hold them in place. These finds are so delicate that they would, these pins are so delicate that they may have been actually to hold a very fine cloth, something like maybe even silk or something with a fine thread in it. Construction then of the castle, it was all local material. So we've got the local ironstone walls. To the north, the sort of functional buildings seem to be mud bonded. The higher, more elaborate decorated buildings seem to be mortar bonded walls. The more elaborate buildings seem to also include limestone tracery, nice fine ashlar tracery, but all the buildings seem to have had Collie Weston roof slates on them. And because they've got slate roofs, you've got to be able to waterproof the ridge line, and so all the buildings were decorated with these decorative ridge tiles, ceramic ridge tiles, all of them with green glaze to waterproof them, and then all of them with these various different sort of finials and crests on them as a part of the decoration. We've also got from, oh dear. I think we're all right. It's saying we're having trouble playing something, but I think we're still live. So I'm going to keep going just in case. We've also got painted window glass from the west of the hall and lead window cane showing that there were glazed windows. So what does all this mean? How do we put this all together? If we remove the areas of excavation and just look at the structural remains, this is the area west of the hall. We've got the hall itself, the late 12th century hall. We've got the western curtain wall with its possible tower and postern gate or window in it. And these are the bits of stonework we found during the excavations. So what it looks like then is that behind this tower, we've got this solar block that is built up against it, and possibly even including the chambers in the tower within it. This looks architecturally to have been built in the late 12th century, so contemporary with the hall. And connecting it to the hall is this covered walkway. And when you project the line of the covered walkway, it heads straight towards an original doorway in the north aisle of the hall. That then was replaced probably in the late 14th century by all these new structures to the south of the solar block and around the side of the solar block, potentially still connected to the hall though by a new covered walkway, and with extra buildings going on to the south. And these possibly connect with the buildings that we see documented in the late 14th century. So in 1373, for instance, there's reference to the Great Chapel and the King's two great chambers being pargeted and whitewashed. And then 2 years later, we've got a reference to a new chapel and chamber being built with a passageway connecting the chapel to the hall. And it tells us that these were stone-walled, tiled-roofed, and with 3 glazed windows, so exactly fitting the evidence we've got. So if we go back to this wider picture, we can now use this new excavation evidence, this new archaeological evidence, and that's sort of the compilation of evidence from the 1950s, as well as the earthworks, to reinterpret what we can see on the ground. And we can move away from this drawing of what is to have a look at what was. And this is our current understanding of the stone castle. We still have very limited evidence for the timber castle. But the stone castle, I think it's fair to say, is a castle. It's not a fortified manor house. It is definitely surrounded by a moat. On the south side, you've got a central gatehouse flanked by two large towers, with at least one other tower on its western side as well. And it could be that there are other towers on certain aspects of it as well, although there don't appear to be any other towers on the eastern side. If you are visiting the castle as a guest, or to use the hall for a visit, the assize court in the hall, for instance, you would go in through the gateway and to the left into what appears to be a large court in front of the hall, probably surrounded by buildings, guest houses, etc. around it. You've got the private residence of the Lord at the west end of the hall, built up against the curtain wall and possibly using the tower as part of the residence, all connected by a covered walkway. To the north of the hall, there seems to be just yard areas, and from the limited excavations we've seen in this area, there's not a lot of structural activity turning up, and it might be that this area was always fairly open, perhaps as yards and gardens and so forth. But if you were working in the castle, or using the castle for work purposes, you would probably enter through the gateway and go to the right, and you'd go round the back of the buttery and pantry on the east end of the hall into what looks to be a large service yard surrounded by buildings. So we've got our workshop here that we've excavated, and then from the earthworks it looks like there's at least one building to the north, several buildings to the east, and further buildings to the south as well. We also know there is a stone lined well in here as well, and so we go through into this working area of the castle. This southeastern quadrant of the castle, though, may never have had much going on, because this is where the motte was. We've got the motte remains here, and this area of uneven ground inside it is the remains of the moat going around the inner face of the motte. So it might be that there was never any sort of suitable building ground here, so this also might have also been fairly quiet. So this is now setting us up nicely for what comes next. We don't know if there's any plans to return to Oakham Castle for further excavations. We hope that there will be. But we've started answering some of the research questions we set out to answer, and in doing so we're raising new questions. And so we are providing, as Time Team gave us a window into where to go next, we are providing a window for where future generations of archaeologists will be going next as well. So thanks for listening. I don't know if the end of it was caught or not. If anyone's still out there, I will answer any questions. If not, hopefully it's recorded everything and you'll be able to catch the bit you've missed on video, assuming it saves the whole thing as well.